At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the protests of the pro-Hamas groups outside the convention hall seemed to kind of fizzle out, but that was okay because the leaders of all of these pro-Hamas groups were inside the convention hall leading the show. I'll have all the details coming up on In Focus. The ultra-progressive magazine The Nation told the tale in one very important headline. It read, "Waving goodbye to the neoliberal Democratic Party." Then, referring to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's address to the convention on its second evening, they said, Hillary Clinton's DNC speech marked the end of the centrist consensus of the Clinton-Obama years. And the article went on to describe how the Democratic Party is now walking away from free trade and a whole bunch of other things and moving towards a more sort of hardcore, progressive platform on a whole host of issues. The one issue that the Nation claimed that the Democratic Party hasn't embraced yet of the progressive platform is foreign policy, and particularly abandoning Israel as a U.S. ally. But the truth is that did happen at the Democratic Convention this week, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that manifested itself in today's program. So the first place I think that we have to look to, of course, is the protests that were happening outside of the United Center in Chicago and all over in thoroughfares in Chicago, including outside of the Israeli Consulate General in the city. Ryan Morrow, a researcher at the Capital Research Center, did a very in-depth report on the organizations that are participating in the protests against Israel outside of the DNC this week.
Of all the groups, we looked at about 280 groups that are involved. We think every single one of them, over 160 of them, 70%, are what we would describe as extremist groups, meaning they support terrorism, including Hamas or another terrorist organization, vocally, or they identify themselves as Marxist, communists, or anarchists, which are obviously ideologies that want a revolution in the United States to overthrow the government and basically reshape everything.
I just want to read the main findings of his research. There were 8 of them, and we're going to put them up on the screen. Number 1, of the 229 groups involved in the anti-DNC efforts, 162, 71%, qualify as extremist groups based on our criteria, which means they support terrorist organizations and other radical positions that they've taken over the year. Number 2, at least 147 of the anti-DNC groups have expressed support for or have ties to terrorist organizations or terrorist attacks. All but a handful of those 147 groups have ties to or publicly support Hamas and or the terrorist attacks on Israel committed on October 7, 2023. Number 3, the Hamas-allied and Iran-backed Marxist-Leninist terrorist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, they were the ones who were the sort of pioneers of airline hijacking in the late 1960s, early 1970s. They carried out the Entebbe hijacking, for instance, of the Air France jet in 1976. So the Hamas-allied and Iran-backed Marxist-Leninist terrorist group, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, has strong and direct links to a coalition that is openly planning to replicate the violent 1968 Democratic Convention riots. This was ahead of the DNC. And by the way, the slogans of it, 2024, repeat of 1968, were actually reproduced on Hamas propaganda organs and on press organs of the Iranian regime, so in English. So this is important as well. They were championing all of the Hamas assaults, all the attacks, all of the atrocities that Hamas committed against Israel on October 7th, and they interrupted their reports with posters calling for people to participate in these protests outside of the DNC. Anyway, that's a PFLP. They also have links, obviously, to Iran. 4, the majority of the identified extremist groups are linked to or have expressed solidarity with at least one of 9 foreign governments hostile to the United States, including Iran, China, Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, Syria, Cuba, Pakistan, and Nicaragua. So these people really hate America as well. Number 5, the extremist groups have ties to or have expressed support for 19 foreign terrorist organizations: Hamas, the Islamic Resistance Movement; Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the PFLP, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Islamic Resistance of Iraq, Lion's Den, that's a Fatah group, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that's a PLO group just like PFLP, the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat al-Islami, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Marxist terrorists in Puerto Rico, Islamic terrorists in Sudan, Lakshar al-Taiba, Hizbul Mujahideen, Duke Taurin el-Milat, and the Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Party. So these are 19 registered or foreign terrorist organizations that are designated as such by the State Department, and the protesters outside of the DNC, the organizations that registered and received licenses to protest outside of the DNC, are aligned with or have ties to all 19 of these groups. Number 6, the coalition to march on the DNC's official statements and website content explicitly support Hamas and the atrocities it committed on October 7, 2023. A group's official involvement in the coalition is a very strong indication that it is a supporter of terrorism. Number 7, a large portion of the extremist groups have engaged in, endorsed, or attempted to assist acts of violence, property destruction, and economic sabotage on U.S. soil that could be justifiably described as acts of terrorism. So they're actually terrorists who are outside the DNC. Number 8, our monitoring of mainstream media coverage of the protests found an almost universal failure to inform readers about the pro-terrorism stances of the groups and activists mentioned and quoted in news articles and on-air segments, okay? So that's what the Capital Research Center's Ryan Morrow found in a report that was sort of a curtain raiser to what to expect at the event at the DNC. And by the way, Professor Jonathan Turley pointed out that the one pro-Israel organization that had applied for a license to protest outside of the DNC was denied a license to do so. In the end, somebody, according to his report, donated to them an area that they would be allowed to have a demonstration nowhere near the DNC, where they were going to be allowed under heavy police guard to actually say something on behalf of Israel around the DNC. And that's them. They didn't get a license from the Chicago mayor, who's been very supportive of the protest groups, and it's part of his whole intersectionality. He, of course, was a mayor who also passed an anti-Israel resolution at Chicago's city council. So that's that. But what's interesting about this, right, is that so their protests haven't gone very well for them. There were supposed to be anywhere between 40,000 and 100,000 of these protesters. They were certainly planning on coming when Biden was the nominee, but what the Harris campaign has done is encompass them inside of the framework of the DNC itself, inside of the Democratic National Convention itself, brought them in, integrated them into the programming, and gave prominent positions, not the least to her vice presidential nominee, Tim Walz, and to Kamala Harris herself, to people who have embraced large swaths or all of this anti-American, anti-Semitic agenda. So I guess before we even go to how they fizzled, we should just show all the same. True, they haven't been well attended. Rather than 30,000, it's more like 1,500, 1,300 people. I think it was just a few dozen who came outside of the Israeli consulate. But here, just to get a sense of the flavor of what these people look like, what they're doing, here they are burning an American flag. And you can see that already burned while they start burning the American flag is the flag of Israel. So that's like as a matter of course. And then the really radical thing they would do is burn Old Glory. And here is an American patriot who tries to save the flag, and he gets creamed, right? So here that is. And then here's another place of them marching. And you see the Hezbollah patches that they're wearing on their garments to show that they support the party of God, if they even know what that is, which seeks the full annihilation of all Jews all over the world, and obviously first and foremost in Israel, which Hezbollah has been attacking with dozens and dozens of missiles and drones and rockets on a daily basis since October 8th, 2023. and these people are supportive of that, right? So that's who they are, and they include, of course, all of these terrorist groups and their supporters. So what was notable is that despite the fact that they seem to be fizzling outside, that there just aren't that many people showing up to these things, and the people who are there are basically lunatics, is that no less of a figure than the still president of the United States of America, Joe Biden, kowtowed to them in his address. When the president was calling very angrily for a ceasefire now and a deal now, et cetera, and not talking about Israel at all, not talking about Israel's right to defend itself at all, never mentioning his visit to Israel to try to soothe the totally traumatized Israeli people in the wake of October 7th. None of that. He didn't mention any of that. He didn't mention that he was a Zionist or his visit with Golda Meir, as he, has repeatedly done to show his bona fides as a pro-Israel Democrat. None of that was part of his speech. Said it was completely even-handed at best until it went off the rails. And this is, again, it's all prepared. He spoke to the protesters outside, and what did he say? He said, let's go to the videotape.
Those protesters out in the street, they have a point. A lot of innocent people are being killed on both sides.
They have a point, right? They have a point, suffering on both sides. And of course, he also talked about Palestinian rights, the Palestinian people. He never talked about Israeli rights. He never talked about the Israeli people. He never talked about the state of Israel. So it's all Palestinian rights. The terrorists outside the DNC burning the American flag, true, not in that great numbers, but that's what they do. That's what all of the organizations essentially that registered, that got licenses to protest outside of the DNC believe in. They hate the United States. They obviously hate Jews. They hate Israel. They burn the flag with a gusto. This is what they love. This is who they are. And they are aligned with, support, and represent 19 foreign terrorist organizations designated as such by the U.S. government. So he said that they have a point. Talk about negotiating with terrorists is more like, again, kowtowing to terrorists. So if they failed, if the protests themselves were a dud, why was he kowtowing to it? Why was it so important to Joe Biden or whoever wrote his speech for him to say nice things about the people outside? It's because the leaders of these people were inside. So I think probably most of you know by now that Joe Biden, who famously said that he works best between 10 and 4, right, 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., he was pushed to the graveyard shift. His speech didn't start until after 11 p.m. Eastern time, 10 p.m. Central, which is really late. And that's according to one of the reports that I read, that people in the stands were already grousing about how they were going to get back to their hotels, whether there were buses or taxis or what have you outside of McCormick Place. And that was when the president of the United States, still president of the United States, was talking. So they were talking over the president as he was screaming about, ceasefire or whatever. And he wanted to get to a peace treaty in between Israel and Hamas. Good luck with that. And all the rest of it. He was at the graveyard shift. And who got primetime billing? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so we've been pretty happy, right, that in the Democratic primary season, 2 of the members of the anti-Semitic squad of ultra-radical, progressive, whatever you want to call them, communist, terror-aligned Democratic lawmakers were ousted in their primary fight. That's Jamal Bowman in New York and Cori Bush in Missouri. Both of them went out with, an anti-Semitic flame, right? And so people were very happy. Jewish donors gave a lot of money to try to get these, out-and-out, fire-breathing Jew haters out of Congress and replaced by Democrats who will hopefully be less hateful to Jews, maybe even not hate Jews. That would be nice for a change. And but they didn't get AOC out. They didn't get Ilhan Omar out. And both of these women have been major stars of the DNC. I'll get to Ilhan in a second. She's more of a side note, but although she's very important, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she has been since 2018 when they were first elected to Congress. She has been the all but official leader of the squad because she's very charismatic, she's beautiful, she's young, and she's got an incredible presence online and in the media. People swoon after this young woman, right, who prides herself at her proletariat roots as a bartender, even though she's very wealthy, and she went to BU and all the rest of it, but that she got her parole bona fides as a bartender for, like 5 minutes before the Democratic Socialists of America repackaged her as a congressional candidate in 2018. All the same. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think it was, The Atlantic. They have this really interesting profile of how AOC is being repackaged, and it's called The New AOC. Right, and I think it's written by Yair Rosenberg. So Yair Rosenberg goes through how she's just been transformed, that she gave a speech in the 2020 Democratic National Convention, which because of COVID and because Biden was hiding, they had it on Zoom, I think. So she gave a major speech there, and she was there as a radical rabble-rouser. She gave a very radical speech, that was replete with Marxist lingo and rhetoric, and, just very, very radical speech. And she was there in order to convince young people to vote for Joe, even though Uncle Joe was considered a moderate, run-of-the-mill neoliberal Democrat. So how do you bring them in? You bring in their leader. And so then, so that was the AOC that showed up in 2020. And then in this week's event, and again, she headlined when the president of the United States was pushed to the margins, she gave this speech that was seemingly very moderate. So this is how Yair Rosenberg put it. So it says, once an outsider staging sit-ins in Nancy Pelosi's office, she is now an insider invited on stage during prime time at the DNC. Ocasio-Cortez accomplished this not by abandoning her progressive principles, but by playing politics to advance them, accepting a seat at the table and making her case there. Formerly a factional leader against the Democratic establishment, she has positioned herself as a bridge between the party's mainstream and progressive wings. And unlike less successful members of the squad, she has transformed herself into a power broker rather than marginalized herself as a perpetual protester. Her political choices, like her rhetorical choices last night, are those of someone who seeks not to fight the Democratic Party, but to lead it. And here we should point out that she isn't the only one. And just to get a sense of how radical she is. So she gave this speech talking about a ceasefire for Gaza. She called for the hostages to be brought home. So you had these liberal Jews who were kvelling and saying, oh, look, she doesn't hate us. Look, she talked about the hostages and how they need to come home. And she didn't say Israel was terrible. But she didn't avow the fact that in March, she accused Israel of committing genocide from the House floor in a speech, right? And then Jake Tapper tried to challenge her on that at his show on CNN, I think the same day in March, and she doubled down and said that, yes, Israel is committing genocide and that she doesn't take these words, lightly, and she's saying them. So this is an out-and-out liar, right? She's repulsive. She's just slandered the Jewish people in the middle of a war for our national survival, calling our war genocidal when, it's been abundantly proven by everybody from Colonel John Spencer, the professor at West Point, to the UN itself, saying that no, actually, the numbers of dead in Gaza that are, being killed in the course of the battle are the lowest recorded in the history of warfare in terms of urban warfare. And, 17,000 Hamas terrorists have been killed, and overall, just less than twice that number of civilians have been killed. So we're talking about the worst, most failed genocide in human history because nobody is getting killed except for the trigger pullers. So this is a pure blood libel that she put out, and she never disavowed it. Why would she? I mean, she's becoming mainstream. She's taking over the party as somebody who abides by that. And what's interesting is that Ocasio-Cortez was pushed forward by the Democratic Socialists of America, which is, a Stalinist anti-Semitic organization, and they've been pushing all of the BDS riots on campuses and all over the United States and harassing Jews all over the place. And so they were the ones who pushed her forward in 2017, 2018, ahead of the 2018 elections that got her into Congress at the age of 28. And now they've disavowed her. They refuse to endorse her because she didn't call Israel a terrorist state or whatever in her DNC speech. So they're mad at her because she's moderating, but she's not moderating. She's just bringing the Democratic Socialists of America's positions into the DNC, and she's not the only one. think one of the most notable aspects of it is that, okay, so on Wednesday night, the parents of hostage Hirsch Poland Goldberg, Rachel Poland Goldberg, and John Goldberg spoke at the DNC, and they gave a very heartbreaking speech about the plight of the hostages. And what was notable about their speech from an Israeli perspective, with somebody with the Israeli radar, is that they said they universalized the victimization of the hostages. They said they were from all religions. They said that they were, they played down tremendously the fact that this happened in Israel. I think they only said Israel once or twice, and it was all descriptive of geography and not that this is a war being carried out by Palestinian terrorists against Israel, but rather that these happened to happen in Israel to a bunch of people who happened to be in Israel, as opposed to this was an invasion of Israel by Hamas from Gaza. So they played that down tremendously. It was extremely universal, their message, their description of the suffering of the hostages. They're Christian, Jewish, Muslim. Well, okay, right? But out of 109, how many of them are Jewish, right? So over 100. So you're talking about, and it was deliberate. And so if you're joining a group of people who don't want to hear specifically about Jewish suffering, that's precisely the way to play it, right? So they're toning down the Jewish identity of their son, of the other hostages, and appealing to the humanity of the people. And it was a great speech. It was a very effective speech, particularly because they were playing to this audience. And that was important. But while they felt it necessary to play down the significance of the specifically Jewish and Israeli identity of the victims, of the hostages, in order to get the sympathy and the support of the people in the hall, the Palestinians felt no such compunction. So first of all, they demanded to get equal time for a pro-Palestinian person, and they got a speaking position for Minnesota Secretary of State Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison was the first Muslim member of Congress, and he began his career as a spokesperson for Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, which of course is a virulently, dangerously anti-Semitic organization that has propagated anti-Semitism into the bloodstream of Black American politics for well over a generation. Back to the time when I was a kid growing up in Chicago, this was going on in the 80s and even before that. So Keith Ellison has a storied history and present of sympathy for terrorists, for terrorism, and anti-Semites. And he was the one who was given the speaking position because the Poland Goldbergs were allowed to speak on behalf of the hostages and their son Hirsch. May they come home very quickly, safely, alive and well and healthy. And that wasn't all. That wasn't the only thing that they got. And Ellison gave a fairly toned-down speech himself. But the DNC also gave a panel, an officially sanctioned Democratic Party organized event at McCormick Place, at the United Center, where they had a panel on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And it was organized by Uncommitted, which is Rashida Tlaib's organization that has become a national organization of Hamas supporters who are demanding that the Democratic Party, Democratic candidates, particularly first and foremost Kamala Harris, but also all of the Democratic candidates for Congress and the Senate and local races as well, express openly their support for the Palestinians and their opposition to Israel. That's what they said, and we'll vote for you, but we're making our votes and our support contingent on you coming out in favor of legitimizing, mainstreaming our positions in the Democratic Party. And so that's precisely what the Harris-Walz campaign did by giving them this space, by giving them this event at the DNC. And I just want to go through, so who were some of the speakers? So first of all, in the audience was Linda Sarsour, who got like a celebrity treatment by attendees at the DNC. And just to remind ourselves, Linda Sarsour is anti-Semite par excellence from Brooklyn. She's got that New York accent. She sounds really cool with her hijab on. In November, she was blocking traffic on the Manhattan Bridge for Hamas, right? So this was just, weeks after October 7th, there was Linda Sarsour. But in August, she was in Chicago being treated like the, but like the eminent lady of the Democratic Party outside of this panel that they held on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. So that's Linda Sarsour, who is now, totally mainstream, totally okay. And participating in the panel were James Zogby, Layla El-Bayed, who's one of the heads of Uncommitted, and I think three other, Andy Levin, who was their Jewish fig leaf, who is anti-Israel, and then three other women who were giving pro-Israel, pro-Hamas talking points at the event. So that was what was going on, and that's what we saw at the event. And what was most important about it was that it took place at the DNC, and it was an officially sanctioned thing, and they called for arms embargo of Israel against Israel, and they called for the United States to support the Palestinians against Israel. And I just want to play you here part of this panel that I found on Instagram last night, just so you can see James Zogby talking about the nature of the panel and what it symbolizes and what it means for the Democratic Party going forward. Just check it out.
When I look at this panel today, it is not the prize. The prize is a change in policy. That's the prize. But what's historic here is that we are having an officially sanctioned panel to talk about it.
Okay, so what did he say in the clip? What did Zogby say? He says, we can. Well, he didn't say this in the clip. He said it elsewhere in the thing, but he said, we can call it what it is. It's genocide, okay? And then he went on, and you saw this, I think, in the clip. But what's historic here is that we have an officially sanctioned panel to talk about it. And then Layla El-Bayed called for here, just let's see her talking about the need for an arms embargo.
But if we stand up and demand action, an arms embargo, a ceasefire, an end to war, we may have an opportunity to restore the soul of the Democratic Party and unite us under a big tent.
So here they are, they're saying, all right, this is cool because this is a Democrat Party sanctioned organized event. You had the fingerprints of the Harris campaign all over the event. They accused Israel of genocide. They brought the uncommitted marches of the party into the mainstream. And then, of course, we saw the mainstream of the party, the neoliberals, the Joe Bidens, the Hillary Clintons, the Bill Clintons, just sort of carted out into the netherworlds of the graveyards, of the graveyard shifts when people weren't paying attention, or they were just boring and nobody cared about them. And, and that's what has happened in today's Democratic National Convention. It's that the marginal groups that were always considered to be the yahoos and you didn't have to worry about them, they are now the mainstream of the Democratic Party, AOC, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, etc., and the pro-Palestinian people. You don't need the terrorists outside to be pushing you because you've already adopted them, brought them in, incorporated them into the leadership of your party, right? That's what Zogby was saying. That's what AOC's primetime speech emblemized. That's what pushing Biden off into the graveyard shift showed, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that this is a very key moment. And then we also have to think about who are the party insiders today, right? So let's just think about, the people that Kamala Harris is turning to for all of her advice. Maher Bitar, we've talked about him before. He was the head of the Students for Justice in Palestine at Georgetown when he was a student there before he joined the Obama administration. He worked for UNRWA, which we now know is a terrorist organization that serves as Hamas's diplomatic arm and logistical base. And he worked for them. And he is today probably the most powerful guy in the White House, except for President Biden. He is a senior director at the National Security Council, and he's responsible not only for the traffic of the national intelligence community, so that he oversees the entire discourse on intelligence, but he recently was promoted. He's also now in charge of all of the discourse on the Pentagon, on the U.S. military. So he knows everything about everything having to do with U.S. national security, and he controls the discussion of it in the White House and between the White House and the Defense Department, the intelligence community, and so on. He's also general counsel to the president, which means that he can enter and exit the Oval Office anytime he wants. He has unlimited access to the president of the United States. Maher Bitar is an Israel hater. He would be very happy if Israel was destroyed tomorrow, very glad. and he is now the front runner to be appointed the Director of National Intelligence in a Kamala Harris administration. So he is, you have all of these Jewish organizations in the United States who are trying to get Students for Justice in Palestine ousted from campuses. I think they were successful in Rutgers and maybe a couple of other places in recent weeks because they're so anti-Semitic and they're violent. But it doesn't matter because the leaders of SJP are now taking over the U.S. intelligence community. And then you don't only have him, you have also Elon Goldenberg, who was appointed, he's a former Israeli. He was appointed first by Obama. He was, we talked about him last week. He was in Kerry's negotiating team trying to force Israel to cough up Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley to the PLO in 2014. That failed. He was one of the members of the Iran lobby inside of the Obama administration on the Iran negotiations, and he's very aligned with the Iranian regime's lobby inside of Washington, D.C. He oversees now as a senior director in the National Security Council. He's, as Michael Duran referred to him, an enthusiastic member and leader of the group of U.S. officials who are responsible for sanctioning Israeli citizens for opposing America's policies regarding Israel and the Palestinians. So, they've been going after Israelis who have been accused of no crime, arrested for no crime, indicted for no crime, and tried and found guilty of no crime for the crime of opposing the establishment of a Palestinian state and seeking to prevent that from happening through civil protests and through legal actions on the ground inside of Israel. So they're being sanctioned, barred from the U.S. banking, the world banking system because the U.S. controls it through SWIFT, and barring them from entering the United States, et cetera. So that's Elon Goldenberg, and he was appointed Kamala Harris's liaison to the Jewish community. So 90% of American Jews support Israel. Elon Goldberg supports the Palestinians and Iran. Oh, and that was the other thing. Eitan Fischberger, a blogger, a journalist on Twitter, he exposed this week that Elon Goldenberg is actually very close to people who have been fingered as Iranian regime agents who actually worked for and received guidance from the Iranian Foreign Ministry just less than a decade ago. And so when one of them was outed, or one of them joined the administration under Robert Malley, her name is Ariane Tabatabai, and she now has a very high clearance job in the Defense Department. She's the office manager or something, the senior advisor to the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Special Operations. Great. So she's aligned or has ties to the Iranian regime. And Elon Goldenberg just kvelled on Twitter when Tabatabai got her initial appointment in the Biden administration. So that's all very nice and cozy. At any rate, so he is out of line with the position of the American Jews, but he is a liaison to the American Jewish community. And then on the other hand, she appointed Nasrina Barghzi, who is Kamala Harris's deputy counsel, to be the campaign's outreach director to Arab and Muslim Americans. And as Seth Mandel at Commentary reported, Barghzi spent years representing and advocating for anti-Zionist organizations, including Students for Justice for Palestine, Bitar's group. For a decade, she was a leader of the movement to knock down legal attempts to grant Jews on campus full civil rights under Title VI. She even took her case against Title VI to Jews, applying Title VI protections to Jews to the United Nations. Okay, so this is her outreach to the Muslims. You have an anti-Zionist Jew who's outreach director to Jews, and you have an anti-Zionist, pro-Iranian Jew also, and anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, pro-Iran outreach director to Muslims and Arabs in the United States. And then you have Meir Bitar, who's an anti-Israel, pro-Hamas guy who's now poised to become the Director of National Intelligence of the United States of America. Talk about the cat guarding the cream. So that's who is in there. And, I think, what we're looking at now is that this is not your parents' Democratic Party. Frankly, this is not your Democratic Party. This isn't the Democratic Party that we've seen throughout our lifetimes, which, as the nation sneered, was a neoliberal or centrist party. And that isn't the truth anymore. What we're seeing in today's Democratic National Convention is that the margins have become the mainstream. The mainstream have been marginalized. And I think we should all just be aware of what is going on going forward as we're watching this race. Kamala Harris is supposed to speak, I think, tonight on the final evening. I assume that her talking points will be very similar to everybody else's. And I'll leave you with this last benediction or whatever that was given by the Reverend Raphael Warnock, one of the outspoken anti-Israel voices in the U.S. Senate. He was elected in 2020. And he talked about the children of Israel and the children of Gaza, and that this year, just look at this clip.
I need my neighbor's children to be okay so that my children will be okay. I need all of my neighbor's children to be okay. Poor inner city children in Atlanta and poor children of Appalachia. I need the poor children of Israel and the poor children of Gaza. I need Israelis and Palestinians. I need those in the Congo, those in Haiti, those in Ukraine. I need American children on both sides of the track to be okay. Because we are all God's children.
So again, this is universalizing things, making moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. The liberal democracy of Israel, the U.S. ally of Israel, is now the moral equivalent of genocidal anti-Semitic sadists, monsters who seek the annihilation of the Jewish people, revel in it, teach their children to become murderers, and they're now inside the hall and outside the hall, just in case anybody inside the hall gets any bad ideas, but they're inside, and they're at the table, and in fact, they're running the board. Anyway, those are my thoughts, and I'll have more of them to share with you next week coming up. Meantime, Shabbat Shalom, have a good weekend.